You know how everyone's always saying to diversify your portfolio?
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
what if the U.S. government, like, decided to take that advice to a whole new level?
Hmm.
We're talking trillions of dollars here.
Yeah,
That's
right.
the world of sovereign wealth funds.
Yeah.
And today we're going to deep dive into why
Hmm.
the U.S. might be jumping in headfirst.
It's a fascinating concept,
Yeah.
especially considering the U.S. doesn't exactly have a reputation for being a savvy investor.
Right.
We've got sources ranging from, financial explainers to discussions on specific companies like Trupanion, which I know we're going to get to later.
Okay.
It's a lot to unpack. But the core question here is, could the U.S. pull this off?
Yeah.
And what would it even look like?
Okay, so first things first. What exactly is a sovereign wealth fund?
Right.
Is this like a giant piggy bank the government keeps under the mattress?
Not quite.
Okay.
Think of it as a state-owned investment fund, right?
Hmm?
Designed to grow over time
Okay.
and achieve certain financial goals.
Right.
They're huge players in the global market, collectively managing over $13 trillion.
Whoa.
Yeah, Norway's fund, for example, covers a significant chunk of their government budget.
Wow, 13 trillion. That's a lot of zeros.
It is.
So where does that money come from?
Yeah.
We talking tax dollars?
So typically sovereign wealth funds are fueled by a country's excess savings,
Mhm.
which, as you know,
Right.
isn't exactly the U.S.'s strong suit
Yeah.
at the moment.
Right.
Most countries with these funds
Okay.
have trade surpluses
Right.
or significant natural resource revenues.
Right, our good old national debt.
Yep.
So how on earth is the U.S. planning to bankroll this thing?
That's the million-dollar question, or should I say the trillion-dollar question.
Yeah.
Um, the current plan seems to be leaning towards repurposing existing assets, what they call monetizing the balance sheet.
Mm-hmm.
Think government buildings,
Mm-hmm.
land holdings,
Okay.
mineral rights.
Right.
The U.S. does own trillions of dollars worth of stuff.
So basically a nationwide yard sale.
Kind of.
What are they going to do? Put the Grand Canyon on eBay?
Maybe not the Grand Canyon,
Okay.
but there are certainly assets that could be leveraged.
Okay.
It's a complex process with a lot of potential pitfalls.
Right.
But the idea is to free up capital
Okay.
without resorting to,
Right.
drastic measures like raising taxes
Yeah.
and borrowing even more money.
Speaking of drastic measures,
Yeah.
I remember reading something about the U.S. government accidentally becoming a Bitcoin holder.
Oh, right.
Could that staff of crypto end up in this new fund?
It's certainly a possibility, though.
Right.
It's a relatively small piece of the puzzle
Right.
compared to the scale of assets we're talking about here.
Right.
But it's interesting because it highlights the potential for this fund
Okay.
to hold a diverse
Okay.
range of assets.
Diverse, like stocks,
So,
bonds,
real
well,
estate.
Bitcoin.
Exactly. Diversification is a key principle for any large investment fund,
Okay.
especially one managed by the government.
Right.
It helps mitigate risk
Okay.
and ensures that the fund isn't overly reliant on any single asset class.
Right.
Like the old saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Right, yeah. But even with diversification,
Yeah.
wouldn't a fund this massive have huge impact on the markets?
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine the U.S. government suddenly, like, pouring billions
Right.
into a particular sector.
Yeah,
I mean, that would,
that's a legitimate concern.
yeah.
A sovereign wealth fund of this size could definitely influence markets,
Right,
potentially leading to inflated valuations
right,
or even asset bubbles.
right.
It's one of the reasons why critics are hesitant about this whole plan.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, I think so.
Huge potential for returns, but also a lot of risks.
Precisely. It's a powerful tool that needs to be wielded carefully.
Right.
And there are some who argue that, the U.S. already has mechanisms
Okay.
for investing in its future.
Like what?
Congress controls the budget.
Right.
They can allocate funds to projects.
Hmm.
There are government agencies that specialize in investments.
So why create a whole new fund?
Right.
What's the point?
That's a question that's being debated right now.
Okay.
Some argue it's a solution in search of a problem,
Okay.
while others believe it's a forward-thinking strategy
Right.
for long-term economic security and global leadership.
Okay.
The Trump administration's executive order lays out some of these lofty goals,
Okay.
but it's pretty vague on the specifics.
Sounds like there are still a lot of unknowns.
Definitely.
So where do we go from here?
Well, the first step is to actually develop a concrete plan. The executive order essentially tasked the Treasury and Commerce departments with, figuring out the funding investment
Right.
strategy
Right.
all the nitty-gritty details.
Okay, so a lot of work to do before Uncle Sam starts playing Wall Street.
Right.
But what happens if they manage to pull it off?
Hmm.
What would a U.S. sovereign wealth fund actually mean for, well, us?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay,
Because the potential impacts are far-reaching,
right.
extending beyond just the financial markets.
Hold on, let's unpack that.
Okay.
We've got a lot to cover in part 2. So we're back, and
Yeah.
we're talking about the potential ripple effects
Right.
of a U.S. sovereign wealth fund.
Big topic.
Yeah, where do we even begin?
Well, imagine this fund impacting everything from, like, the price of your groceries
Okay.
to the stability of the global economy.
Mm,
It's not just about returns.
okay.
It's about influence.
Okay, that's a pretty broad scope.
Yeah.
Can you break that down a little?
Sure. Let's start with the potential for market distortion.
Okay.
If the U.S. government becomes like a major investor, right,
Mm-hmm.
their decisions could artificially inflate prices in certain sectors,
Right.
creating asset bubbles.
We touched on that earlier, but it's worth emphasizing.
Yeah.
It's not just about picking winners and losers. It's about potentially skewing the entire playing field.
Exactly. And then there's the question of, like, how this fund would be managed.
Right.
Would it prioritize economic goals
Okay.
or political objectives? Would it be transparent and accountable?
Right.
Or would there be a risk of, corruption and backroom deals?
Right, because we're talking about trillions of dollars here.
A lot of money.
That's a lot of power.
Yeah,
And with power comes the potential for abuse.
absolutely. And there are legitimate concerns about bypassing congressional oversight.
Right.
Traditionally, Congress has the power of the purse,
Right.
meaning they control government spending.
Mm-hmm.
But a sovereign wealth fund could potentially shift that balance,
Right.
giving the executive branch more financial autonomy.
So this isn't just about economics.
Right.
It's about checks and balances.
Yep.
And who ultimately holds the reins of power.
It's a complex issue with far-reaching implications.
Okay.
And it's important to remember that this fund, if created,
Right.
wouldn't exist in a vacuum.
Okay.
It would be operating in a global landscape where other countries already have their own sovereign wealth funds,
Mm-hmm.
some of which have been used to achieve geopolitical goals.
So the U.S. might be playing catch-up
Yeah.
in a game that's already been going on for a while.
In a sense, yes. And that raises questions about how the U.S. fund would interact with these existing funds.
Right.
Would it be a force for cooperation or competition?
Hmm.
Would it be used to further U.S. interests on the global stage?
This is a lot to consider.
Yeah.
We've got potential economic benefits,
Mm.
potential risks of market manipulation,
Right.
potential political power shifts,
Yep.
and potential global implications.
That's right.
It's almost like a choose-your-own-adventure story,
Kind of, yeah.
but with the fate of the U.S. economy hanging in the balance.
And it's not just the U.S. economy that's at stake.
Right.
This fund could have ripple effects throughout the global financial system.
Okay, I'm starting to get a headache just thinking about all this.
It is a lot.
Can we shift gears for a moment
Sure.
and talk about something a little less daunting?
Yeah, what do you have in mind?
Well, you mentioned private markets earlier.
Oh, right.
And that sounds like a whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
Is that something the average person can even access?
It's definitely more complex than buying stocks
Right.
at a public exchange,
Okay.
but it's becoming increasingly accessible thanks to platforms and funds that pool resources from multiple investors.
So instead of buying shares of Apple,
Yeah,
I could potentially invest in a startup
right.
developing the next big thing.
Exactly. Or you could invest in real estate projects,
Okay.
infrastructure development,
Mm-hmm.
or even a portfolio of early stage companies
Right.
through a venture capital fund.
That's pretty cool, but isn't that super risky?
Well,
What if the startup flops?
Yeah.
Or the real estate market crashes?
there's definitely more risk involved,
Okay.
and it's important to do your due diligence.
Right.
But with higher risk comes the potential for higher returns.
Okay.
And remember, diversification is all about spreading that risk.
Okay, so I wouldn't put all my money in one startup,
Right.
but I could allocate a portion of my portfolio to private markets as a way to diversify beyond traditional stocks and bonds.
Precisely. It's about thinking outside the box and exploring opportunities that align with, your risk tolerance and investment goals.
So circling back to the U.S. Sovereign Wealth Fund,
Yeah.
would they be investing in private markets as well?
It's certainly a possibility.
Okay.
In fact, many existing sovereign wealth funds
Right.
have significant allocations to private equity, venture
Okay.
capital, and other alternative investments.
Right.
It allows them to access potentially higher returns
Okay.
and diversify beyond public markets,
So they could be funding the next Tesla or SpaceX.
potentially. Or they could be investing in infrastructure projects that benefit the U.S. economy,
Like what?
like renewable energy,
Okay.
transformation,
Mm-hmm.
or even things like high-speed internet in rural areas.
That's a far cry from buying government bonds.
Yeah,
It sounds like this fund could have a real impact
yeah,
on innovation and technological advancement.
absolutely. And that's one of the arguments in favor of creating this fund, the idea that it could help the U.S. maintain its competitive edge
Right.
in a rapidly changing global landscape.
But we also have to remember the potential downsides.
Of course.
Market distortion,
Right.
political influence,
Yeah,
the risk of corruption.
it's true.
But it's a lot to weigh.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Right.
And ultimately, the decision of whether or not to create this fund
Mm-hmm.
rests with policymakers.
Okay.
But as we've discussed today, the principles of diversification, risk management, and
Mm-hmm.
informed decision-making are relevant to all of us,
Yeah.
whether we're managing a trillion-dollar fund
Right.
or a personal investment portfolio.
Okay, so no matter what happens with this U.S. sovereign wealth fund,
Right.
the key takeaway is to think long-term,
Yeah.
diversify your investments,
Hmm.
and stay informed about the ever-changing world of finance.
You got it.
You got it. But you mentioned private markets earlier,
Yeah.
and that sounds like a whole different ballgame.
Right.
Is that something like the average person can even access?
It's definitely more complex than
Alright.
just, buying stocks on a public exchange.
Right.
But it's becoming increasingly accessible
Okay.
thanks to platforms and funds that pool resources from multiple investors.
So, like, instead of buying shares of Apple, I could potentially invest in a startup
Yeah,
developing the next big thing.
exactly. Or you could invest in real estate projects
Yeah.
or infrastructure development,
Right.
or even a portfolio of early-stage companies through a venture capital fund.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But isn't that super risky?
Well,
What if the start flops or the real estate market crashes?
it's true. There's definitely more risk involved,
Okay.
and it's important to do your due diligence, of course.
Right.
But with higher risk comes the potential for higher returns.
Okay.
And remember, diversification is all about spreading that risk.
Okay, so I wouldn't put all my money into one startup, but I could allocate a portion of my portfolio to private markets
Yeah,
as a way to, diversify beyond traditional stocks and bonds.
precisely. It's about thinking outside the box
Okay.
and exploring opportunities that align with your risk tolerance
Right.
and investment goals.
So circling back to this U.S. sovereign wealth fund, would they be investing in private markets as well?
It's certainly a possibility.
Oh.
In fact, many existing sovereign wealth funds have significant allocations to private equity, venture capital, and other alternative investments.
Okay.
It allows them to access potentially higher returns and diversify beyond public markets.
So, like, they could be funding the next Tesla or SpaceX.
Potentially. Or they could be investing in infrastructure projects that benefit the U.S. economy,
Okay.
like renewable energy, transportation, even things like high-speed internet in rural areas.
That's a far cry from buying government bonds.
Yeah, it really is.
It sounds like this fund could have a real impact on, like, innovation and technological advancement.
Absolutely. And that's one of the arguments in favor of creating this fund,
Okay.
the idea that it could help the U.S. Maintain its competitive edge in a rapidly changing global landscape.
But we also have to remember the potential downsides, right?
Of course, yeah.
Market distortion, political influence, the risk of corruption, it's a lot to weigh.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the decision of whether or not to create this fund rests with policymakers.
Right.
But as we've discussed today, the principles of diversification,
Right.
risk management, and informed decision-making are relevant to all of us,
Yeah.
whether we're managing a trillion-dollar fund or a personal investment portfolio.
Okay, so no matter what happens with this U.S. sovereign wealth fund,
Yeah?
the key takeaway is to think long-term,
Hmm.
diversify your investments,
Absolutely.
stay informed about the ever-changing world of finance.
You got it. And don't be afraid to explore new opportunities. The world of investing is constantly evolving, and there are always new and exciting possibilities on the horizon.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive into the world of sovereign wealth funds and the importance of diversification. It's been an eye-opening conversation.
My pleasure. Always happy to share some insights.
And to our listeners, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What are your biggest questions about sovereign wealth funds? What are you most excited or concerned about? Let us know, and we might just explore your questions in a future episode. Until then, keep learning, keep investing, and keep diving deep. This is The Deep Dive, signing off.